Good afternoon, fellow Rotarians. I am Reed Miller, Vice President of the Rotary Club of Portland. Welcome to our live weekly membership meeting. Today, I am filling in for our President, Ruth Shelley. For this meeting, I'll be sticking to her format, but next year, you'll be getting a bit more of my personal spin on the meetings. But before we get started today, I want to again express my gratitude for all of the Rotarians that have already made a generous donation to our trust drive. Remember, this is the one time of the year that we ask for donations, which fund all of the incredible committees that we have that do all of the great work in our community all year round. Our trust drive will be coming to an end at the end of this month. If you have not yet made your pledge, it's game time. But first, before we get started today, let's welcome Rotarian Patsy Feeman for our reflection.
Good afternoon, Rotarians. Yes, our lives have been and continue to be disrupted. A major event such as happened last week in our nation's capital in the midst of a global pandemic. It sweeps into our lives and impacts us on an individual as well as collective level. With such intensity and uncertainty, it's easy to take sides and perpetuate divisiveness. It's also easy to bury our heads in the sand and hope it all goes away. Yet the counterintuitive move, I'd say the Rotarian move, is to use our voices and actions for inspiring and cultivating light and unity, despite the circumstances. So how can we move past our differences and find a way to heal our divides? While each of our experiences are unique, there are common themes of truth, honest dialogue, and understanding. Healing is possible, but we have to be willing to act, willing to slow down and connect to other people, to listen, acknowledge each person, to get curious, ask others to share, or ask ourselves to consider what is the heart of the matter for them? What are their fears and their hopes? To promote belongingness, where people do not simply tolerate difference, but ensure that all people are welcome and feel that they belong in society. And to be intentional, to bring each other, our families, and our communities together. Marianne Williamson said, in every community, there is work to be done. In every nation, there are wounds to heal. In every heart, there is the power to do it. The opportunity for us is then, will we react to change and uncertainty, or will we reshape the future? Thanks.
Well, thank you, Patsy, for that touching and very timely reflection today. And I'll remind all Rotarians that we do have openings for the last two meetings of 2020. If any of you would like to give one of these reflections, please fill out the link provided in the chat box or email Siobhan. Now, I would ask that Rotarians who have invited a guest to raise their hand, and Maria will call on you to unmute them and introduce them.
I am shuffling.
Or if you are visiting.
Oh, sorry, Reed. I am shuffling through to see if we have any of our guests here. And I do see that we have again our guest, Michael Castro from the Peace Corps is joining us, and a second-time guest, Scott Jacobs. I don't see any of our Rotarians raising their hand for a guest, but I see Scott and Michael have joined us again.
I guess I could go first. This is Scott Jacobs, and I'm the principal of Jacobs Strategic Group. I was enlightened last meeting by having the opportunity to sit in on your meeting and also be part of the breakout session, which was very rewarding. What my company does and what I do is I take a lot of pride in elevating companies and careers to be more successful. And during this pandemic, there's been a lot of need for that.
Thank you, Scott. And I see we have one more guest, LaKanya. Would you like to unmute yourself and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. Lakiana Drury here. I'm the Executive Director of Word is Bond, and I was invited by Leslie Bunker, who offered to sponsor membership for me for the year. So excited to join you all I might have attended a meeting in person at one point, but Word is Bond is a nonprofit here in Portland, Oregon, and our mission is to rewrite the narrative between young Black men and law enforcement. So we have a 6-week summer internship program for young Black men that engages with police officers across the area. And then we also do leadership activities throughout the school year. So excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And by the way, kudos to you. Used your electronic blue hand to raise your hand. I've been trying to train everyone to do that, and you did it without the training. So congrats on that. Back to you, Reed.
All right. Thank you, Maria, and welcome to our guests. Thank you guys very much for attending. We're very happy to have you, and hope you join us again soon. And now I would like to extend a happy anniversary to everyone who joined Rotary Club of Portland in January. We alternate each week honoring birthdays and Rotary anniversaries for the month. Please note the names of these anniversary people and reach out to one of them with a call or an email, since keeping up our memberships during this challenging time is more important than ever. All right, please welcome Rotarian David Attia to tell our committee, Wheels of Power, the Committee of the Month. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Reed. If everyone can hear me. Scott Lofton, who's the ongoing several-year chair of the Wheels of Power Committee, gave the initial report last week. Scott described the purpose of the Wheels of Power Committee, which is to provide mobility to those in need of a powered wheelchair or scooter. It's one of the longest standing committees that we have with our downtown Rotary. Scott also described the process that we go through in receiving applications, some of the numbers relating to how many scooters and wheelchairs our Rotary Club is able to provide each year, and shared some very personal letters and examples from the recipients of the Wheels of Power program. Today, I want to just look at a few examples, but if we can take the type of day that we have in Oregon right now with lots of rain coming down, and imagine a situation where you're limited by just a walker or having to use a manual wheelchair. Trying to do errands, shop for groceries, go to a medical appointment, possibly to visit a friend. The challenge is immense for those individuals who do have limited physical mobility. Many times we're asked the question as to why powered scooters or wheelchairs for those who have disabilities are not provided by Medicare, Medicaid, or private insurance. This comes back to, I guess I'll call it regulations, which say that if an individual is able to take care of their, what we call basic daily living activities, that they don't qualify for this additional mobility. So they may be able to walk just a few feet to prepare a meal, to use the bathroom, possibly to get dressed, even if they have a caretaker. But if you are able to do those limited activities within your living unit, it essentially disqualifies you either through the government, federal government, state government, or private insurance from getting a mobility device. So this is where our downtown Rotary Club, comes in to be able to assist those individuals who want to be able to get out and participate in the community and have their own independence. Let me give a brief example from a visit that we made a couple years ago. We are unable to make personal visits now to applicants, so we're handling that like on a WhatsApp, a Zoom, or over the phone. This individual had a very good job in manufacturing. A family with 2 or 3 children, benefits and everything, and was accidentally injured in a gunshot accident, which paralyzed him from the waist down. He lost his job. He lost his benefits. He spent months in the hospital and was finally released to rehab. At his home, it was not handicap accessible. So working with community resources, he was able to find a living within the city's subsidized housing. When we visited him, his room was essentially a cot with maybe 3 or 4 feet on the side and a length of a total 10 feet in the room. He was dependent on everyone for assistance, whether that was food, personal items, anything, because all he had was a manual wheelchair. Even at 34 years of age and in great physical fitness before the accident, it was very difficult to go to any doctor's appointments or any other activities that he had to get to, let alone be able to go and visit his family. The Downtown Portland Rotary Club, through the Wheels of Power Committee, was able to provide him with a powered wheelchair, which greatly helped in his several months of rehabilitation, which followed the accident, visits to his family, searching for a job. And it really gave him the optimism and hope to move forward with his life after that tragic accident. The individuals that we interview face not just physical challenges to their mobility, let's say to their legs, but many times many other medical complications, certainly financial, very few financial resources, and oftentimes do not have any family or friends to help them. And so Rotary comes in a very encompassing way to provide this support through the Wheels of Power. I'm always amazed at the independence and optimism that each of the applicants for these mobility devices have. Despite the fact that they're shut in without this, there's this hope that we all have as individuals to be able to participate in the community, socialize, do our own errands, shop, go to doctor's appointments, just go to the park and just be involved. And I'm uplifted every time that our Rotary Club and the Wheels of Power can help an individual in the community to be able to participate in this manner and see the tremendous resilience and hope that they have. So I'll conclude by saying that what I've liked about the Wheels of Power Committee is seeing the direct results that come from our Rotary Charitable Trust activities in a very one-on-one way. We can see directly how we help that individual. I've been in Rotary for almost 40 years, and the Wheels of Power Committee is the most rewarding committee that I have served on during that time period. I'd like to thank all the Rotary members for their donations to the Trust Board, which supports the activities of Wheels of Power and our other committees. And if you do have an interest in joining the Wheels of Power, you can contact myself or Scott Lofton, who's the chairman, or certainly through the office. Thank you very much, and you should all be very proud of your Wheels of Power Committee through the Downtown Rotary Club. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, David. What a great story. One of my favorite committees by far. You guys are always doing great work out there in the community, and really proud of the work that you guys are doing. Scott Burns is not able to be with us today, but if he were, he wanted to give an update on the Salvation Army Rotary bell ringing. So he's asked that I give the update for him. He's actually down, virtually down in Bend doing a presentation for the Bend Rotary Club today. So this year's bell ringing looked very different as it was virtual, but we still made a huge impact with our total coming out to $19,827 collected and donated to the Salvation Army. And we thank all of you who contributed. That is something we can all be very proud of. Thank you. Okay, now we are going to disappear and enter a virtual table talk. Please introduce yourselves to the others in your group. A minute or so before you come back to this main meeting, you'll get a visual heads up. I think we're going to have about 5 or 6 minutes for our table topics today, and may I suggest a topic for your discussion? New discoveries. During this pandemic, we've all had time for some new discoveries, a new TV show, a new musical artist, maybe a new walk that you like to go on, or a new hobby that you've discovered. Okay, we are off to our table topics. Here we go. Now, I hope you guys all learned something about your fellow Rotarians and got a moment of community there, a little bit of interaction. It's always good to chat with everybody and catch up with our fellow Rotarians. And on to our program. After our speaker today is finished, if you'd like to ask a question, Maria will moderate the Q&A through the chat box. So you can reach to Maria via the chat box or raise your hand. And now please welcome our President-elect nominee, Rotarian Maria Schell, as today's chair of the day.
Thank you, Reed, and I'm so sorry that all of you are hearing from me so many times. My backup for doing the Q&A and muting all of you is Kurt Mardig, one of our amazing Rotarians, and he and his wife are expecting their first child this week. So he said he could not promise to be here in fear that he would be in big trouble. So please give Kurt and his wife our best as they're excited to welcome their first child. But excited to be here as chair of the day to introduce you to a colleague and friend. I know you all saw the information about Dr. Levitt in our spokes, but I'm going to share a little bit about who will be speaking to us today. So pardon while I read a little bit of it so I don't get it wrong. But Keith Levitt is a current associate professor and Betty S. Amundsen faculty scholar in ethics at the College of Business at Oregon State University, and also serves as our associate dean for research and teaching. He came to OSU in 2011. From his last role, he came to us from the Army's Center for Professional Military Ethics at West Point. Dr. Levitt received his PhD in management and organization from the University of Washington. His area of research interests include behavioral ethics, identity, situated judgment, social judgments, and other research methods. And some of his current research in Maria terms are two broad areas: behavioral ethics, predicting when people will lie, cheat, and steal at work. And recently, work and home life spillover, when events at work or home lead to consequences in other domains as a function of stress, emotions, and obligations. You can read his work in a lot of amazing outlets, from the New York Times to Forbes and Fast Company. But I love on his bio, his probable most proud place you can find his work is on the front of his mother's refrigerator. So he claims that is a great place to see his research. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Keith Levitt to share today. Keith?
Thank you, Maria, for the very nice introduction. It's fun to be joining all of you and get a glimpse inside what you're doing with Rotary in Portland. So thanks for having me along. So for my talk today, I was invited to talk about business ethics, which is a pretty broad topic. It's like being asked to talk about North America. And so depending what your angle of research is, or what field or paradigm or discipline you're coming from, it's obviously going to mean a lot of different things. So I'll qualify ahead of time that I'm giving you a little toe into my world, and it would be different than if you invited a philosopher, a business strategist, an ecologist, a theologian to talk about what business ethics means to them. So I want to talk to you a little bit from a behavioral ethics perspective. As Maria mentioned, I study things that predict when people lie, cheat, and steal within organizations, as opposed to more the sort of externally facing things organizations do. As a quick talk overview, though, the ethical reputation of companies and what we see companies doing is probably more critical than it ever has been before. We have a 24-hour news cycle that creates a lot of transparency and also does a great job of sensationalizing when things don't go well for organizations. We know that shareholder activism is on the rise, where groups will lever stakeholder rights to be able to go and buy small amounts of stock to be able to push issues on the ballots at shareholder meetings. Social media spread customer boycotts to become more and more common. And then even we see groups like BlackRock even driving responsible investing practices. So things that organizations do in getting to profitability probably matters more than ever. And while the idea of hiring ethical people with the right values intuitively sounds like a great solution, and it's something we hear about a lot, unfortunately, it often doesn't work. And I want to talk to you about why that approach doesn't work. and give some quick insights into why most organizations are really fertile ground for unethical behavior, kind of just as a function of how humans operate. And so I'd like to provide you, as opposed to that idea of hiring people with the right values, a slightly different way of thinking about the problem for keeping the behavior of those people that may work for you on track, and also in our own sort of decision making. But I wanted to open this up. I hope we're set up to be able to do this. I wanted to open this up with a quick poll or a little demonstration. And now bear with me, this one seems a little bit wonky at first, but what I'd like to open up with is what I call the heaven question. And if you have a religious orientation, this one's probably less abstract for you than for others, but assuming there's a grand reward or a heaven for living a life of good deeds, what would you estimate your likelihood of being granted admission is? In other words, based on an assessment of your own character and behavior, how likely is it that you'd make your way through the pearly gates? So I know it's a strange thing to ask and to share in public, but just bear with me, there's a point to this. So if you can go ahead and think about that for 1 second. And I'll let Saban let me know when we have the tally. Okay, good. Well, so it looks like most people are in that above 92 to 100% range. We have a few people being a little more cautious in that 85 to 91%. 77 to 84% seem to be hedging a little bit just in case. A couple other people maybe just holding themselves to a high standard, but we're seeing relatively there. The good news is we're sitting in a room of mostly good people, and that's a good thing. But that's also potentially a problem. I'd like to talk about why. Now, back in 1997, US News and World Report did a representative survey, and this was based on current data at the time, right, or current events, of 1,000 Americans. And importantly, they selected this as a representative sample, and they asked people, how likely is it that different individuals would make their way into heaven? Now, keep in mind, in 1997, this is sort of right around the Lewinsky gate. Bill Clinton was running about 52%, right? Not doing so well on people's moral sort of scale at the time. Michael Jordan, this is right after the Bulls had come off of a national championship. They gave him 65%. Now you want to talk about a hard crowd. Mother Teresa, somebody who devoted her entire life to helping impoverished people, wow, 79% chance of her making it through the pearly gates. One person was given an 87% chance, right? One target when asked was given an 87% chance. Now that person is the same one that I just asked you about a minute ago, and that was yourself. The problem is we live in a world where most people, for the sake of maintaining a sense of meaning or a sense of purpose or navigating the world with their self-esteem intact, most of us think that we're among the good guys. Now, this is a problem if we're looking in terms of how we think about or would report character. We all think of ourselves as good people, and part of this is because we actively forget our own ethical behavior. Now my colleague and friend, Miriam Kuchaki, has done some great work published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science around what's known as ethical amnesia. And in this research, she even had people just read stories where the protagonist in the story was either themselves or another person. And the character in that story was either doing something that we would view favorably or something that would be really kind of viewed as unethical or problematic. And she brought them back to the lab about a month later and asked them to write down as much as they could remember about those stories. Now, when the stories were about something favorable, people remember details like the color of the curtains or other things that were in the story just as well, whether it was about them or somebody else. But when the character in the story was them and they were portrayed as behaving in negative ways, people's memory of the story even dissipated. And it turns out we do this with our own autobiographical events all the time. We remember those things that we did well and which maintain our sense of self-consistency while also forgetting about those times where we maybe weren't so great. In other words, we tend to believe that our values are really driving our behavior, largely because we forget about the times that they didn't. So we frequently use our values to frame and justify the things that we've done. I'm sure if you think about what happened at the Capitol this last week, I have no doubt those people that were involved saw what they were doing or would frame it now in terms of their values. but it doesn't mean that values are actually going to be a good predictor of ethical behavior. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about why. And the first thing you sort of need to know about why hiring good people or thinking about character doesn't work is based off of a starting assumption from a really large body of literature. Now, I like to call this the moral distribution. Now, the moral distribution would be drawn from a large body of research where behavioral ethicists bring people into the lab and give them the opportunity to basically lie, cheat, or steal during the experiment to benefit themselves. And of course, we pull some different levers and try to see under what conditions people will be more or less likely to do so. Now, one really interesting step back, though, from hundreds of studies in this area is we find that about 10% of the time, about 10% of the people that are out there, no matter what you do, no matter what levers you try to pull to make them behave better or not, as long as they think they're getting away with it, about 10% of the population is always going to rip you off in these studies and steal the money from the experiment. Now, in good news, about 20% of the population always does the right thing. No matter how tempting we make it for them to rip off the experiment, to cheat to gain an advantage, to do anything that will make them better off, there are about 20% of these people that are pretty saintly. So one nice takeaway from today is there's about twice as many really good people in the world as there are really crappy people. So hopefully that's going to make you feel better. But on the other hand, that leaves the 70% of people in the middle. And those 70% of people, the way they behave, whether they're ethical and virtuous, or whether we find them to be the people who lie, cheat, and steal, is really going to depend on what's going on in the context around them. Now, from a hiring perspective, if you say, I'm only going to hire really good people, well, assuming you could identify them, that gives you only about 20% of the population. Now, clearly, if you can identify that 10%, you want to keep them out, right? This is how we end up with some really disastrous situations. But for most of us, most of the time, we have to think a lot about the context. I want to talk a little bit about why the context in organizations frequently tips us, or at least gives a hedge towards bad behavior. Now, the first of these assumptions is that business is characterized by complex, equivocal situations, and we're usually following multiple goals at one time. Now, when I say complex and equivocal, imagine you're designing an airbag system for a new car. And I were to ask you about how many failures per 50,000 that could result in death would you be willing to tolerate? Well, a good ethical answer would probably be 0. On the other hand, it's not an answer that would ever really work, or you'd never be able to build a car because the airbag system would cost $1 million, right? So we already have, at some point, these compromises and trade-offs we have to make. I'm going to give you a little quick example, though, of something, a little demonstration that I think helps relay this point a little bit as well. Turn to my next slide here. Okay, so I'm going to show you a quick little video, and I want you to just pay attention really quickly to the instructions and try to follow along. Let me make sure that my audio on the share is enabled. Give me 1 second. I'm actually going to stop the share and then reopen. This, just to make sound.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count?
Okay, quick moment of audience participation. Somebody call out to me how many passes you saw from the white team.
15.
15.
14.
14. Did you come up with anything
13.
different?
10.
10.
10? Okay, let's see what the real answer was.
The correct answer is 15 passes.
Wow.
But did you see the gorilla?
No. No.
I like to think that this gorilla actually is a pretty good metaphor for thinking about business ethics. When we show up and go to work in the morning, the last thing we're doing is thinking about, gee, I wonder what kinds of moral dilemmas I'm going to find myself stumbling into today. What we think about is the goals we need to accomplish, the people we need to interrelate with, the things that need to get done. And sometimes, inconveniently, gorillas just walk into the room. And if we're not well equipped for thinking about them, or gorillas aren't in our discussion, right, then we miss them when they occur. If you were to look at most organizational ethical problems, people realize after the fact that they were standing in the middle of a mess, as opposed to being prepared for it ahead of time. And just quickly, before I get to the next one, were you able to hear the audio okay on that? Okay, perfect. Second, and this is true of all human behavior, but organizations make us really well positioned for this. When we're really not sure what to do, when we're faced with novel situations and uncertainty, we look around and then we also look up to leadership for answers. Now, in organizational settings, especially when newcomers on board, there's a lot of uncertainty about what they're supposed to be doing. They may not have the expertise, and people sort of learn the rules by watching others. To show you a quick little demonstration, I think does a good job of showing this.
To answer that question, we set up a hidden camera experiment to see if this woman would stand up at the sound of this tone, simply because everyone else is. You might be thinking you'd never go along with this. Or would you? After just 3 beeps, and without knowing why she's doing it, this woman is now conforming perfectly to the group. But what happens if we take the group away?
Elaine, please.
Okay, now she's alone. The crowd is gone and nobody is watching her except our hidden cameras. What do you think she'll do? She's now conforming to the rules of the group without them even being there. Now, watch what happens when we introduce another outsider who doesn't know the rules.
For a noon appointment. Have a seat and they'll be out in just a couple minutes. Great, thanks so much.
Okay, and as the video continues and more people come in that are not in on the experiment, she gets them doing the same things, again, not knowing why. When we think about when you're new to an organization, you usually know less than anybody else there. And so you make the assumption that their behaviors are going to be good or be virtuous. What we find is that in situations where there's an organizational whistleblower, when somebody recognizes a problem and calls it out, it's very frequently because somebody has a lot of experience in that same industry, moves into that company, and then realizes things don't look right. This is exactly what happened at Olympus a few years back, where they got a new CEO, the first American CEO heading up the company, and he recognized on day one that they had an extremely corrupt board and been mismanaging the books for years. Imagine on day one being a new CEO who gets to whistleblow on his own company, right? But newcomers don't have that luxury. When we're not sure what's going on, we don't necessarily look for a right answer. We look to others to give us an answer that we're at least comfortable enough with. And then finally, the last piece of this little trifecta is that we really underestimate the pressures that are going to influence our behavior in the moment. You know, when we sort of sit back in a situation like this and talk about the importance of values or business ethics, it's very easy, or if I were to give you a case study, to make the right choices and make the right decisions. But that ignores how we would actually behave in the moment. A really clear example of this, think about your own goals for the remainder of 2021. Think about it in terms of your work habits, exercise, your diet, your financial choices, how much time you're going to spend staring at one of these, right? We all have those things where we say, gee, this is what I intend to do over the year that's about to unfold in front of me. But in reality, we're actually two different people depending on our time horizon. When we think about ourselves in the distant, our values become really salient and become very important. But in the here and now, there's a lot more going on that we tend to miss. My colleague Katie Milkman at Wharton has done some really great research with online grocery orders and then also movies ordered by mail. So one of her studies, she partnered with Netflix in Australia. So this is when they were still mailing DVDs to your house, right? As opposed to streaming. So you'd get online and you'd have to say, gee, these are the movies that I want to order, and they're going to show up in 3 or 4 days. What she found was that when people are ordering movies that are going to show up later in the week, they kind of went equal parts on things that were kind of hedonically fun movies, things like The Notebook, but also mixed in some documentaries, some foreign films, Academy Award winners, kind of more highbrow stuff. But when they looked at what came back, right? So in other words, when do people actually watch it? It turns out that when Friday night comes around and you're tired, well, you don't really want to read those subtitles. You don't really want to sit through an emotionally laden 2.5-hour Academy Award winning film. You just want to watch the thing that feels good and is fun. And similarly with partnering with Amazon Fresh, she found that when people are ordering groceries for delivery and those groceries are coming in 3 days, people tend to order a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables, lean meats, nuts, and things like that. What do you think happens though when people are ordering groceries that are going to be delivered in the next hour? The cookies, the chips, the soda, things like that start showing up. So really, when we're making our future plans, we think in terms of our should selves and who we really want to be and who we really want to be like. But in the moment, our want self sort of really takes over. So things like Selma get replaced with movies that are maybe of less cultural value, and fruits and vegetables get replaced with things like ice cream. Now, as a quick example of how these sorts of pressures or our ability to change on the spot actually pop up in the real world, I'd like to just give you a quick glimpse into one study from one of my previous publications published in the Academy of Management Journal. So when I was still working for the US Army and the ethics think tank, in this one particular study, we brought in 128 combat medics that were in the final 3 months of training. Now, if you think about combat medics, they're an interesting kind of breed because on the one hand, you have a soldier identity, and they loosely joke around about, we kill people and we break things is what the Army does. But on the other hand, you have this medical identity, which is we heal people, right? And we bring people back to health. These 2 different hats that they can wear. So what we did in this study is we gave this group of Army medics, we sort of marched them into a room and gave them a lengthy survey that I designed and framed as a language processing task. In other words, we told them we were only interested in how professionals process language. Now, most of this really was just a boring survey with some basic little like word problems and things like that. But they were assigned randomly to one of 4 different versions of the survey. And the way the survey differed was the watermark on the page. Half of these participants either saw the silhouette of a soldier or the US Army logo as the 92% transparent watermark that they're reading all the questions through. The other half of it either saw the medical obsusa or the Red Cross logo. So the idea is as they're reading all of this, it made more central to them either their soldier identity or their medical identity. Now, one of the questions buried in this sort of set of problems asked this. Currently, the Army offers an average settlement of $2,500 to the families of Iraqi civilians accidentally killed by American forces. Of course, this money could also be spent on other important things. How much, dollar amount, do you think should be given to each of these families? So pretty morally laden question, but at a time where we're asking them these sort of basic problems. Well, when we gave people this question, we found that almost 30% of them, when their medical identity was active, crossed the question out and answered everything else, or even wrote in the blank, I can't put a price tag on human life. This doesn't feel good to me. By contrast, those were randomly assigned just to a watermark on the page that activated their soldier identity. Well, this became sort of a very common and easy thing to do. Only about 7% of them refused it. And we followed this study up with other populations. The most interesting one was engineers who were also managers. Engineers have a really strong professional orientation about competing on merit and only within their abilities. And managers have an obligation to shareholders. And what we found was depending on whether they were asked to think of themselves as a manager versus an engineer, again, using very subtle techniques, when people's manager identity was primed, they said, hey, sometimes you got to go ahead and grease the skids. You've got to be willing to endorse corruption in Bangalore, India to get things done. Versus when we activated people's engineer identity, they were very, very likely to say, hey, this sort of behavior is not okay. Now, in all of these studies, we asked people afterwards, was there anything about the study that would have impacted your moral judgments? And of course, everybody says, no, these are my values and how I think about things, not recognizing that very, very subtle cues in the environment were enough to push around their moral compass. So what are some of the takeaways we can maybe think about, right? Sometimes looking at pieces of this but also just thinking in terms of the broader field of behavioral ethics. What can we learn about how we can make organizations and maybe ourselves a little bit better? I would argue that one thing we really need to think about is focusing on clean barrels instead of good versus bad apples. For organizations, this can include thinking about nudges in the workplace context. A great study done by my colleague Sridhari Desai at University of North Carolina, she had a study within a restaurant that was a pay what you want restaurant. So the idea was you go in, you have a meal, and there's a little room where you go in and you make a donation afterwards to cover the cost of your meal. Now she ran a little A/B experiment that when people went back into that room, there were either pictures of sports heroes, or on some days there were pictures of people that would be viewed as sort of moral exemplars. So Martin Luther King or Gandhi or people like that. And what she found was that on average, people paid about $1.50 more for their meal on the honor system when they saw examples of moral exemplars versus just sort of everyday people. So those little nudges over time can really add up to getting people's behavior better. But maybe sort of less cute or more important would be to design incentive systems that reward ethical processes and not just outcomes. So in other words, having built into the way you evaluate your salespeople, did they just scam somebody to sort of push the numbers up, or did they behave in ways that are really good for the customers long run? So thinking about our incentive systems and making sure we're actually rewarding what we want and not just the outcome. Also, leadership matters. There's great research that communicating ethical values while modeling ethical behavior really does cascade down organizations. There was a study that was done in the US Army looking at people's evaluations of leadership, multiple levels up. And when the chain of command had people that were evaluated by their peers as being really ethical leaders, 3 levels down, it was predictive of soldiers behaving in ways that would be really questionable or even be war crimes in the battlefield. Even if they had never met these commanders 3 levels above, the behavior of those commanders influenced the behavior on the ground level. So leadership matters, but not just in terms of what people say, but in terms of what they actually model for people. And finally, adding accountability pressures and transparency is a great way to push ethical behavior. Make people be able to justify the decisions they engage in, right? And make sure that people know that their behavior might be audited at some point. Great example, if you were to look at Sears Auto Centers in the 1990s, they put a lot of pressure on the managers to raise sales. Unfortunately, they didn't look at how they did it. And so this created a situation where somebody would go in for an oil change and they would say, hey, your air filter is absolutely filthy, and show them an air filter that was dirty but wasn't actually the one from their car. So they were doing things to force labor that they didn't need to be selling to customers, right? But increasing accountability and auditing people keeps them from engaging in those sorts of behaviors. For individuals, some takeaways that we sort of know from behavioral ethics. First, avoid ethically sensitive or important decision-making when your self-control resources are likely to be compromised. When you're sleepy, when you're hungry, when you're feeling emotionally depleted, these are situations where that want self instead of the ideal value-driven self tend to kick in. This is when people tend to make quick decisions that feel good in the moment as opposed to making better decisions. And finally, some research increasingly showing that there's a skill in learning to live with dissonance and being able to maximize trade-offs. So a great example of that might be, I consider myself to be pro-business and I consider myself to be a capitalist. I also consider myself to be environmentally minded. Well, there's a tension there. And to simply say, let's disregard one versus the other in the name of practicality may let me off the hook, but it may not actually lead to better decision-making. So learning to live with dissonance, learning to live with tensions, recognizing that you may hold 2 values at once that are pulling you in different directions. There's research showing that's where real wins happen. When people are more comfortable dealing with ambivalence, and it is a skill to learn to be good at ambivalence, then people make better decisions and come up with solutions that really sort of maximize trade-offs as opposed to compromising one thing versus another. Now, I realize this was sort of fast and in the abstract and covered a lot of ground all at once, but I was trying to kind of minimize the impact on your time while kind of giving you a taste of sort of the research that's being done in and around behavioral ethics. But it was a lot of fun being here, and I really appreciate the invitation and the ability to kind of talk about the subject with you from a little bit different angle than you probably usually think about it. So thank you.
Thank you, Keith, so much. This is where I now get to lead the Q&A part as well as had been the one introducing you. But I know I just thank you very much for showing what this research is telling us. And I wrote down a lot of things and I'm noodling on many of the topics. We do have a question already in the queue from Rotarian Mike Pendergast. Mike?
Thank you, Maria. I have a broad question, not sure how to encapsulate it into a small question, but how do this knowledge, some of this seems pretty novel, and I'm wondering why it is novel. Like, how do we incorporate this throughout the whole society, whether it be through education, and so that it can be utilized and to create accountability within prisons, or to help change behavior within prisons, or within police organizations themselves, or within politics, or for example, when police have to deal with difficult situations, how to help, potential suspects maybe navigate their behavior. So how do we disseminate this in a broad level so that all of us can maybe do better?
Yeah, Mike, would you like to be a dean of a college of business or maybe a university president? No,
Sure.
this is, kidding aside, this is always sort of been the challenge of behavioral research, is the standpoint that the incentive systems for developing this knowledge, the incentive systems for distributing it in meaningful ways and helping organizations make sense of it aren't always well aligned. Now, we are getting to a point where, fortunately, I think it's become more normative in my field and related fields for people to write popular press books and do things that help disseminate it outside of the ivory tower a bit. So for example, Katie Milkman, the one who's done the really cool research on, sort of want versus need self and how people make decisions in the near term versus the long range. She has a book coming out on, behavioral change, a popular press book coming out on like how to do better really soon. Or, somebody who's been great in my field about it, Adam Grant has had, I think, a fourth book coming out soon that's about translating sort of what we learn about at least work and how people work better over to that sort of audience. But I think there's been a disconnect from the standpoint that on the one hand, academia rewards sort of scholarly work for an academic audience. And on the other hand, the effort involved in translating that and getting it useful, well, there's already big cottage industries of consultants and people who are much more polished than we frequently are at coming up with solutions. And so those things don't always meet as they should. But I do think there's some evidence that organizations are getting better and smarter about doing these things. For example, Google now has probably 7 or 8 PhD level industrial organizational psychologists and org behavior people working in their organization to try to just even do more of these A/B experiments. And every 2 years, they've been hosting like a little mini conference where they fly like 30 of us down just to talk about how organizations can interface more with kind of the behavioral research. Now, with that particular organization and others, I don't always necessarily feel good about what they intend to do with it. But on the other hand, there are more efforts, I think, in place to try to leverage that. So part of it is just, somebody who's interested and somebody cares, reaching out, finding those pockets of expertise and saying, hey, I'd really like to do a project to fix something. And OSU, I think, as a land grant, we have an obligation to interface in meaningful ways, with stakeholders in the state, while also having some talent on board, that can do those things. So it takes just somebody, I think, of goodwill to kind of shake us out of our ivory tower a little bit, and those things get moving. So yeah, thank you.
I think we have time for one last question. Patsy Feeman, Rotarian, will ask our final question, and then I'll hand it back to Reed. Patsy?
Thanks, Maria. Can you hear me? So I have kind of the bookend question to Mike's, and that is, you talked about as leaders, whether we're CEOs or leading teams or even leading our families, that we need to develop some new skills and practices, and how easy it is for us to get swept away in kind of the norm. So I'm wondering, and what skills and practices that you see that as leaders we're needing to develop so that we can stay more aware of what's going on in our environments.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think, especially the world we live in now, where it's very easy to find, confirming and comforting data in quotation marks, I guess, to help us sleep well at night and feel good about what we believe. I think just getting in the habit of asking ourselves, what would make me think differently about this, right? What would change my mind? And being open to having our minds changed would be a big one. I think being willing to ask people for feedback and candor, and actually making it comfortable for them to do so is a great thing for leaders to do. I think even the other thing, even really good leaders miss a lot of times, is walking people through your decision process and how and why you're doing things. social learning theory and psychology, people will be like you to the extent to which they can actually emulate what you're doing. And so if you can break down the steps of your decision making and how you're going about it and why, where people will understand it, you're more likely to get that same sort of behavior. And there's plenty of research that's been around for a while that shows in organizations, ethical leaders don't need to just be good people. They need to make sure that the people working around them understand that. And then those people actually become better ethical decision makers. And as a bonus, those people that aren't going to become better ethical decision makers don't like those environments, and they tend to leave.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for those great questions, Mike and Patsy. Excellent questions. Next week, we will be hearing from Rotarian Jack Kerfoot on renewable energy in Oregon. This meeting will once again be live via Zoom at noon on Tuesday. Today, I want to thank our virtual guests. And Patsy, thank you for your reflection today. David, thank you for your insight into the Wheels of Power Committee. And Maria, thank you for all of your help today. You were all over the place. Finally, Keith, thank you so much for your presentation. That was insightful and very well put together and easy to follow along and very entertaining. So thank you very much. I enjoyed it very much.
Thanks, Reed. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, on that note, this meeting is adjourned. Ding.